Hello, and welcome to this 15th video in a series looking at the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 16. We're looking at the first three verses, which are sometimes called the godly qualities or spiritual qualities. If you've already tuned in on any of these videos, you know the story of what's being done here and how we start. If you have not, if this is your first tuning into one of these videos, I might suggest you take a look at the introductory video that I have placed out there. That'll give you a bit of background. I placed the introductory video there so I don't have to repeat the same thing at the start of every one of these videos. And whether or not you've been following along, well, if you've been following along, you know that we begin with a little bit of break from the day's activities. If this is your first time joining us, welcome. What we do before we jump right into the reflections here is just take a moment to get some sort of a break from all the day's activities. It's we run around a lot. As I said before, we run at 90 plus miles an hour almost all day long. As you will see with this video and any of the previous, this is life in the slow lane. It's basically just the reflections and the talking, no fancy editing, no special effects. I think the words themselves are, at least what I'm seeing, are the key item here. So before we get any further, let's just take a moment, whether you eyes closed, eyes open, just let's take a moment to come to rest. We have no place to go, nothing to do. If you're tuning into this, you've got a period of rest and relaxation coming along. Good. Well, again, ladies and gentlemen, we are at our 15th video in this series. We are looking at chapter 16 of the Gita, and we are on verse 2, and let me just hold that up so that you can see that. Now, of course, if you're not familiar with Sanskrit, it's just a bunch of squiggly lines on the piece of paper. Fortunately, I'm here to do the interpretation. The best would be to reflect upon the words in the original Sanskrit. It can certainly be done, but since that's generally not what we hear every day, unless you're tuning in from some place where the language is still spoken, the reflections are on the English translations, although I do believe that we kind of get a little bit of a back and forth on this. But in any event, for those who are just joining us, let's just hear verse 2, some of which we have already looked at in detail. So verse 2 is Ahimsa Satyam Krodhas Tyaga Shantir Paisunam Dayabhute Shwalalotwam Mardavam Rir Chapalam. Now, if I were, in fact, a Vedic priest in India, this would be unrecognizable. This is an Americanized version with the New York accent of the Sanskrit. It's actually better that I do take them word by word. If you were to go out to either eBay or Amazon or actually the internet itself, I believe that there are on YouTube some other readings. So if you were to hear this by someone who speaks the language as, again, a Vedic priest, what have you, it would be about 10 times faster than I read this through, and it would have a different sound to it. For the purposes here of this series, what we're really doing is hearing the words and seeing what they bring up. And just so that we are clear, what we have already covered in this series on verse 2 is ahimsa, which was harmlessness. There was actually 2 videos on that. We did satyam, which is truth. We did akrodha, absence of anger. Today we're doing tyaga, which is renunciation. Coming up is shanti, which is serenity or peace, and apaisunam, absence of calumny or calumny, probably the first pronunciation, and so on down the line. Now, I actually was going to do this video earlier today. It's in the afternoon right now. And I was, as happens a little bit on this, I was a bit stumped. There isn't, as we'll see in a minute, there isn't a lot of definition around tyaga, which is renunciation. What I found out, I took this with me to lunch, and in between pizza and soda, was reading through here. Does wonders, by the way. Sanskrit, pizza, soda, okay, all goes together. And I was looking here, and as I've held up many times, I use the Gita with the commentary by Shankaracharya. And it turns out that while I was looking this over at lunch, I came to the commentary on verse 2, which I've actually kind of skipped in so far in verse 2. But let me just read you Shankaracharya's commentary. And again, we've spoken about who that was. Just go out on the internet and take a look at it. Around 800 AD, kind of cleaned up the spiritual mess that was going on in India at the time. And his commentary on verse 2 is as follows. Harmlessness, abstaining from injury to sentient beings. Truth, speaking of things as they are, without giving utterance to what is unpleasant or what is false. Absence of anger, suppression of anger arising when beaten or reviled. Renunciation, tyaga, literally giving up, we'll get to that definition in a minute, is thus explained since almsgiving has already been mentioned. And as you say, the light bulb went off because we already did giving, okay, in the previous video. And tyaga, after I read this, I said, that's kind of the difference. Let me just continue on here. Compassion to creatures, those in suffering, serenity, tranquility of mind, uncovetedness, unaffectedness of the senses when in contact with their object. We'll get to that one. And absence of fickleness, not to speak or move hands and legs in vain. Sorry, guys, I may not make it on that one. So let's just jump into the definition, because with the commentary, it helps a little bit. So we did ahimsa, we did satyam, just going through the pages here, did akrodha, and renunciation. So here we have tyaga, and the definition of that, we always start with the definition straight out of the dictionary and see where that leads us. And so the definition there is as follows: leaving, abandoning, forsaking, quitting, discharging, giving up, resigning, gift, donation, distribution, sacrificing one's life. Now the root, we always take a look at where the root of these words are. The root is tyaj, and that is given in definition as to leave, abandon, quit, to leave a place, go away from, to let go, dismiss, discharge, to give up, surrender, resign, part from, renounce. And we have a whole bunch more definitions there. Avoiding, getting rid of, freeing oneself from, giving away, and even more than that. But I think just in those definitions right there, we get a sense of it. Now, even though some of the actual English translations and definitions are the same as giving, dana, it's the commentary by Shankaracharya that kind of gives the clue of the direction when he says that we've already talked about giving, almsgiving, which we just did as giving. It doesn't have to be somebody in need, although we certainly talked about that. We talked also about giving from parents to children, to loved ones, whichever way that gift is given. We talked about purity of gift. Here the sense is a bit different. You're in a way in the same spot that you were with giving, meaning at the start of the activity there was something, at the end of activity there is not. You, the person either giving or giving up, are no longer in possession of the thing that was given away. And again, the commentary makes clear, and I would have to almost go back and redo giving, which I'm not going to do, to take this into account. But what we're really talking about here, I think, is more in the letting go. And in fact, I think when we did truth a couple of videos ago, we were at some point almost singing "Let It Go, Let It Go." Hope we don't have to pay anybody royalties for that. But the intent, the sense of renunciation, is more of just letting go. And in fact, I had to actually go to the English dictionaries just to look up renunciation. It's not a common word. In fact, it is so uncommon in English that when I went and started looking at the dictionary definitions, I came across on Google an article that I think it was about 2 years ago. The Church of England has in fact taken any reference to both renunciation and the devil out of the baptism rites. So for those of you old enough like I am to have watched The Godfather, you will recall as Michael ascends to power, he knocks off a few of the people who would have stood in his way. And it's a great cutting, it's great editing, and cutting of the film of Michael with his son being baptized versus all the people meeting various grisly ends as he takes them out. And you thought we were talking about godly qualities, didn't you? But during that ceremony, the words that I remember, and I think that's what the intent is in the film, is, do you renounce Satan and all his acts and all his deeds and whatever the rest of that is? Now, interestingly enough, I think that over the course of whatever the years are, the idea of the devil has turned fairly comical. It's a Halloween costume. It's I always think of Futurama, the devil with the golden violin, or the devil went down in Georgia. I think where I'm getting to is the modern view of devil or Satan is fairly comical. I am sure if I went to I don't know, is it evangelical or, I just keep thinking Deep South church, or if you think of the exorcism, that there is some recognition of the power of sin, however you believe that power is either available or if it's embodied, that's where you might still see some of this devil and Satan in a form. But getting back to the renunciation, as I said, it is even in English such a non-used word that the Church of England decided that they weren't even going to bother with that and renouncing Satan. And I don't know what the wording is, but it was meant to be helpful to the modern person. So we understand giving fairly easily, but what about this idea of giving up? I did mention in a previous video about Lent, the period of Lent, 40 days before Easter in Christianity, that, and I have said before, I grew up Catholic, where during that time you give up something. So when you're a kid, you give up, either desserts or ice cream or candy or something like that. But the idea of that is exactly the idea of what renunciation, in the way that it's given in the Gita, is there. And I saw another definition, which is basically giving up something that you're perfectly well entitled to, such as your ice cream or your candy if you're a kid, willingly. And you may not ever get it back. And again, that it kind of is close to the giving, but it is not a necessity on your part to renounce whatever the item is. However, in terms of speaking of this in godly qualities, we kind of get the sense of, okay, yeah, you may not want to give it up, but it may be to the benefit of both yourself, but usually to the people around you, to give these things up. Certainly there are enough, I call them the A groups, OA, AA. I know there's others, but the ones that come straight to mind are alcohol and food, which in themselves would not necessarily present a problem. People need to eat. People like to drink. I mean, you don't need alcohol to survive, but it is definitely something that, myself included, I like. I always used to joke, I have Italian on one side and German and Irish on the other side. My chances of not drinking are about 0. However, like we will see later on, there's a certain amount of measure and moderation to these things. Now, for example, and I'll just pick alcohol, if in fact your degree of drinking is such that you come on home and everybody runs and hides because you're going to be physically abusive, which is why we spend so much time on harmlessness, and I think we said we'd bring this back up again. A giving up, a renouncing of alcohol would be a useful, caring, compassionate thing for those who are around you. So I'm just trying to see if there's anything else in the way of the English translations that will help with this. But basically, abandoning and forsaking, swearing off alcohol, swearing off ice cream or whatever, not just this 40-day stuff. And people talk about being clean and sober after giving these things up, and giving them up because they are in fact destructive to yourself, but even more important than that, to those around you. And as we've kind of discovered a bit during reflecting on these, your bad habits, your meanness, lack of compassion, hatred, and anger tends to spew out to those closest to you. There's kind of a paradox that those who we profess our greatest love for, whether it's spouse, children, relatives, and friends, those are the people who tend to get kind of the shrapnel that's flying all over the place from your inability, and we talked about control of the senses, from your inability to control how you interact with everything around you. And to listen to those who have gone through this is basically and we're not doing a whole OA or AA program here, but there's basically just, I think one of the first things is just realization of how much of a lack of control that there is. And I think they're called 12-step programs. And then there's steps along the way. But the point of getting back to the renunciation is, it is a voluntary giving up of things. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be causing harm or destruction of to those around you. And this is again where the line gets a little tricky between giving and renunciation. Certainly you see it on the generosity of people who donate money, whether it's public TV or to any of the various crises that occur in the world. And on the one hand, you'd say, well, of course, they get a tax write-up and in making that donation, and it really isn't a renunciation. And yet, in a certain sense of this leaving in a bed, I mean, they are giving up, they're leaving, they're abandoning money that they certainly had no obligation to part with, but yet they do. Now, in the end here, and again, it's always tricky. I try to keep this just to here, but it's very difficult not to jump back and forth between other religions. For me, Christianity, since despite a lot of people believing that Catholics aren't Christian, but despite that, I definitely have had a Western Christian background, whether it's being raised Catholic or everybody else around you being some Methodist, Episcopalian, Pentecostal, whatever. That's not unusual for Western civilization. It's very Christian based. And the interesting thing at the end here, which is decidedly Christian, is sacrificing one's life as yet another renunciation and abandonment of forsaking. And sacrificing one's life immediately reminds me back in the Bible of Jesus is saying, greater love hath no man than this, that he lay down his life for his friends. That's not the exact quote. I don't have that with me right now, but you get the picture. So, yeah, there's a big difference between OA and AA and laying down your life for your fellow friends, and it doesn't have to be the laying down the life. We're not talking necessarily has to be at that level that Jesus says. Just think of. It also goes back to feel. It's really nice how this many videos in, you can keep seeing how all of these reinforce each other. We talked way on the first video on fearlessness and what it means to have somebody in, let's say, wartime, who is leading the troops and needs to care for the people underneath them, and in fact may themselves have to lay down their lives so that the rest of the company gets through. Most of us are not called upon to that level of renunciation in our daily life. Certainly wartime is an exception. And one could even say that any of the doctors, nurses, anybody working in the hospitals, no matter how well they're suited up right now, have such a love of helping their fellow human beings that they basically are taking their life in their hands to treat us, for those who may have come down with COVID-19. But the idea, the action, the impulse is the same regardless of the level. And you could, of course, say, yes, it's easier to give up drink than it is to give up your own life. I know a couple of people who may not necessarily agree with that, who have had, I know some have had a seriously tough time and made it, and I unfortunately know those who just couldn't be turned from it. But whatever it is that we're renouncing, forsaking, giving up, doing away with, leaving, quit, leave a place, go away from, it does kind of have this gentleness. It's just a leaving it, or at least once it's accomplished. I think there could be a lot going on leading up to the moment. And again, I'll go back to Christianity, Jesus praying, let this cup be taken from me. I think up until the actual event, the actual renunciation occurs, you have possibly a fight, whether it's a simple prayer at night in the garden, or 10 or 15 years of a fight against whatever it is, food, alcohol, abuse, anger. You pick your poison, as the saying goes. But the key move, there's two, I'd say two ways of approach. One is purely from love, that you love your spouse, you love your children, you love your friends, you love your relatives. You love them enough that you realize that your own wants are of less importance than showing compassion to them, or at least stop abusing them in some way or another. And the other, which I was just reading something basically talking about, God's will, thy will. And the other way is, although it might be called a form of love, but the other way is just this, thy will be done. And if you take it from that itself, the ability to say, not my will, but thine, gives you a sense of what renunciation, what we're pointing to in here. Not the same as given. And again, I can, thank the commentary in there, which says, okay, we've already discussed giving. Now we're talking about a different state of mind. In both cases, though, there's not really an expectation of receiving anything in return. And in fact, I probably want to say a bit more about that. I just don't know what, because we kind of hear this as we go along. But looking at the time on the clock here, we're probably ready to take our part 1, part 2 break. And I'd like to come back and kind of explore that a little bit more. So with that said, let's I take a break for a few minutes. For you, I just put a few second part 2 in there. But we'll be back in a few minutes or a few seconds from your point of view to continue on the discussion, reflections on renunciation. Hello, and welcome back to part 2. We are considering Tyaga, renunciation, from the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 16. This is the second verse of chapter 16. Now, one of the things that unites both giving and renunciation, we were just talking about before the break, was the idea that this is not a bargain. This is not, as the saying goes, I'll scratch your back if you scratch my back, or one hand washes the other, or whatever the common phrasing might be for what I call all the business dealings that go on. Yeah, I'll do your roof for a good price. Would you be able to help my friend over here? He needs some siding done, and it would be good if you helped him. Now, in some way, if that doesn't get if you don't get too carried away with that, you're at the, to me at least, the limit of ethical business practices. But leaving that aside, really where I was aiming at for the whole idea that there isn't an expectation of even exchange is in everything that we are provided with that enables us to live as we do. Now, I leave it up to you. I always say, pick your favorite deity from whatever religion you're in. If you're not religious and you think it's just the forces of nature, that's fine. But for what we're going to talk about, it really doesn't matter. But, going back to the Mel Brooks, Carl Reiner There's something bigger than Phil. Look that one up, okay? We do not have to get up every morning and negotiate for our water and our air. At least we in America generally don't. There are certainly places in the world that are things like water are cut off and controlled. We're not talking about that kind of a horrible situation where either one human being or one set of human beings actively steals the gifts of the creation. I mean, man, I think there's deeper levels of hell than Dante even wrote about for those who would do such a thing. Although, oddly enough, his lowest levels was treacherous to guests, which most people would not put on, what about murderers and stuff like that? And why does treacherous to guests get one of the lowest levels? And why am I saying that? Those who are traveling with everybody else on this planet in their journey of life, why is that such a horrible thing? Well, for one, and I'll keep it as God, just, because Phil doesn't sound great, or stealing from the creation. How about that? We keep it nice and neutral, and nobody has to write in about that sort of stuff. However the case may be, if you find yourself corralling and literally keeping away water, food, ground, land, I mean, we talk about buildings and rent, what have you there, all of these things that if somebody somehow or another gets the power, that they could steal or they can charge for what was given freely. And this is really the renunciation of the creation, the non-expectation of return. We talked about it for individuals. Now we're taking a slightly bigger look at that. This is as I said, you don't wake up in the morning and need to negotiate for air and water and the trees to be there and the sun to be shining. We've lived that way so long that we take it for granted. But going back again, like I said, about the abounding grace that we're all, if we so desire, able to pick up. Well, it's a little bit easy with sunshine and water, where we just go out and there's the sun shining. But the creation as a whole gives that freely. It just leaves it. It is a sacrifice in a way. It's a sacrifice of the creation and of itself to each of us so that we may live. And that goes from us as humans all the way down to the one-celled organisms that are on this planet and whatever else is hanging out in the rest of the galaxy. It is an example. So this is why I say, well, I don't have to say God. If you don't like that, just get up in the morning and take a look around, and you have your teacher there. The sun shines freely, the birds sing freely, fruits and vegetables grow freely. That's your teacher. I'm not, what you call a tree hugger or anything else like that. But isn't it wonderful that you can wake up in the morning and you have a perfect example of renunciation, giving, the donation, again, go back and forth between the two of them, of an example of that every day, every minute. And as I said, the crime and the sin is in groups of people, whether it's one, a company, a government, a whole country, somehow or another stopping the natural flow of the gift of life that we receive. That's a terrible, terrible crime. We're not going to do, I mean, if you are so called, and there are people who do, and can thank whoever you would like to thank for that, that people do go out and fight against this sort of stuff. Most of us are either blessed enough that, yeah, you pay the water bill to the local water company. Not so much, I think, that you're paying for the water, but for the fact that they get it right to the faucet in your sink. But whatever the case may be, it is a living, breathing example of gift giving, of renunciation in action. And there's, again, the creation provides what we need to know these sorts of things, but it really, really is just a wonderful thing. Just need to stop for a second, open your eyes, and see what we're given here. Now, normally at this point I go, yeah, because, everybody says, yeah, well, that's your story. And the amount of people who I find willing to be first in line just to say how bad things are is quite amazing. I'm really not interested in them. I'm interested in those of us who are aiming to be first, second, third in line, to say, you're looking at it the wrong way. It's way better than it appears. And if we continue to reflect upon these words, we kind of get the sense of the godly qualities in action. When we talked about purity of being and honesty and wise, and we talked about harmlessness, which goes along with this renunciation as we talked about it. This is only 15 videos in, and minor reflection. I mean, again, this is skimming this, but the wealth of the creation it's amazing. The fact that nobody picks it up, and go back to the story of the king who was going to give away his kingdom. I don't, and there's lots of people shake their fists at God or the creation and stuff like that, but I don't really think it's God's fault that you're not picking up, getting the clues here, or picking up everything. It's like walking along the sand and there's diamonds and rubies and emeralds, and all you're complaining about is sharp stones. Well, pick them up and make use of them. So that's just again, as these all are, a quick look at what might be gleaned from reflecting upon renunciation. And I am glad that I went back and looked at the commentary to see how that links up and contrasts with straight out giving. But they all, just about every word that we've looked at here, are spectacular examples of opening the heart, of letting out. You're just as capable as the rest of the creation of giving and renouncing and loving and being compassionate as any other person, place, or thing. We're all gifted. Okay, we're all gifted, and whether we use it or not is not something that you can blame on anybody else. Whether we use it or not comes from your ability to give, your ability to renounce, your ability, looking at the next word, to be at peace, your ability to be honest and wise and compassionate. I know that up until now, I've always talked about, gee, wouldn't it be nice if you ran into people, and people who were all these qualities were who you had to deal with. We're growing up a little bit now, ladies and gentlemen, as we look through this. And of course, the real thrust of this is not so much what are other people doing to you, it's what are you doing to them. Are you holding on to things for your own pleasure that are making other people's life miserable? Are you in such a state that people don't want to be around you just out of plain old fear? Are you dishonest? Are you untruthful? And it's funny because most of us, and I raised my hand, and yep, you'd say not, but again, part of this is it is not only reflection on these words, it's self-reflection. So for whether it's myself or yourself, anybody watching, where these ultimately lead is, sounds like good stuff. That's for the people who think it sounds like good stuff. And then the next question is, well, is that actually how you're living your life? And I'm not going to ask you, the viewer, that. You need to ask the people around you, because we do not see how we do not see in truth. I mean, we all have some idea of how we are, but we don't really see fully how we appear to those around us. So, if you're strong enough, if you are able to withstand what might come back, you would ask those around you. Am I giving? Am I loving? Am I caring? Am I honest? Am I truthful? Whatever the words. Is it a peaceful experience dealing with me? Everybody who comes in to see you, by the time they get done, they do need a drink when they're done with you, because it's just such a horrible experience. I'm not saying that every one of us has all of these qualities, but again, this is something that anybody watching can, in 2 seconds of Googling, get this list of words and reflect upon it themselves and see what happens. I think those around you will really, really, really appreciate it. So I'm going to leave it at that. I think that this probably certainly doesn't need another video right now. We will move on to Shanti, peace, for the next video. But reflection on any sort of scripture, especially something as I've said before, dense as this, that needs time to look and be blossomed out, is really very useful if you care about those around you. And if, as I say, if this is not your cup of tea, there are plenty of other videos, cat videos especially, plenty of them out on the internet. So until next time, enjoy.